Hi, and welcome back to another episode of the 401 Access Denied podcast. I'm your co-host, Mike Ruin, VP of Engineering and CISO here at Cybrary. And once again, I'm joined by my co-host, Joe Carson from Thycotic. Joe, you want to give us an intro and tell us what we're going to be talking about today?
Absolutely. It's a pleasure to be back, and hopefully everyone's been enjoying the recent episodes. But we have a very special episode today, which I'm really excited to have a really well-recognized and well-respected industry expert. So it's fantastic to have such a special guest on the show today. So Dave Kennedy, welcome to the episode of 401 Access Denied. And today we're going to be really going into, a day in the life of a security expert and researcher. And really covering a lot of important topics, things that are really important in the industry. So, Dave, welcome to the show. Do you want to give us a bit of background into what you do at Trusted Sec and the things basically you deliver to the industry?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much for having me on today. I really look forward to it. And been in the security industry for over 20 years, everything from a chief security officer all the way to, security researcher. I always like to maintain my technical roots in everything that I do. That's what I enjoy as my hobbies. So even though I'm a CEO of two companies, Trusted Sec and Binary Defense, I'm always in the weeds, developing tools and hacking into customers and doing all the fun stuff that we get to do. But it's great because, we have teams now that do all that stuff, and I get to learn from a lot of other people and really, work back and forth with some just brilliant individuals where, we're helping organizations get better with security. We're pushing research forward. We're looking at what other groups and adversaries are doing to ensure that we stay up to date with everything that's happening. It's a continuously moving industry, and being part of that is just an awesome thing. So yeah, thanks again for having me. I look forward to the discussions today.
Absolutely, yeah. For me, I've also 25 years in the industry, and every day I'm learning something new, and it's really important. One of the things I find is surrounding myself with industry peers where we all come from different backgrounds and different skill sets. But every time I'm talking to them, listening to them, I'm always learning something new and interesting. And I think that's what's really important. It's an industry where some people forget that there's a large portion which is that day-to-day administrative stuff, the things you have to do. But you do have to spend. I spend probably a large amount of my time, 30%, I think, into actually continuous learning and continuous understanding. I'm not the greatest developer, but I've always get my hands dirty in things like Python scripting. My background in Perl is not the best these days, or COBOL, but it's always that continuous learning. And even getting into looking into. Yeah, it's Perl was one of my scripting languages a long time ago, but not the greatest at it. Let's say if it was still being used today, I'd be quite surprised. So, but yeah, absolutely. Continuous learning is something that I think is very valuable. I spend 30% probably of my time just even getting into understanding and pulling things apart. Dave, you mentioned you're still hands on. How much of the time are you spending continuous learning, and where do you kind of pull that educational information from? Where do you get it from? How do you continue that?
Yeah, that's a great question. When you're running multiple companies, the biggest thing is time management is so important. Time management for yourself, personally, your family, those types of things. But also, where do you spend most of your time at? And for me, some of the biggest areas are, I've put in a great leadership structure both at Trusted Sec and Binary Defense that the company's really run autonomously, with the great leadership structure. So it affords me a lot of time to be able to focus on, making sure that we're staying visionary in the company, that we're, ahead of the curve when it comes to what adversaries are doing, and that our teams are top notch. That, the type of work that we're doing is important. So, I would say that, I'm definitely in the 30 to 40% range of research and understanding and spending time, to dive into what we're doing, hopping on engagements and helping out with customer environments. So, for me, it's making sure that I spend my time appropriately to ensure that I can still stay, at a top level in my career, because I don't want that to ever, atrophy or to go away. As you mentioned, the industry changes all the time, and you can easily fall behind with everything that's going on there. So for me, I work very closely with our threat intelligence team, understanding what's happening from, an adversary perspective, what different groups are doing, which groups are prominent, what are we seeing from a capabilities perspective. Obviously in the news, you see the stuff with like JBS and Colonial and all those different ones. What is REvil up to? What do they look like? What are they doing from a capabilities perspective? Is there anything there that we need to add to simulate those types of environments? On the Trusted Sec side, working with our research and development teams on our weaponization and tooling, We like to do a lot of cool research and cool things that we don't disclose or publish, that we, kind of go out and do things in the wild with our customers. Those types of things are really a lot of the focus areas. Maintaining, internal tools, maintaining internal methodologies, updating how we do things and communicating that out. Those are all important things for me to go and do. So I really rely heavily off of my team, but also, social media is a great area for researchers. You look at what a lot of the great researchers out there are doing, like Dirk Eon from an Azure perspective. And, there's just so many great researchers sharing their information out there that, you start to see, okay, well, hey, this is an area that I'm not familiar with, and I want to dive down into it. And I have the flexibility to say, okay, well, I'm going to spend 4 hours on this to understand what this is, or spend a couple days on this to understand what it is, because it's relevant to my interests. And, I think that's the cool thing about the industry, is that, we're very keen on, collaboration, sharing, and building upon one another, which you don't see in a lot of other industries. And that's really, how this industry continues to move forward. And, there's a lot of discussions on offensive security tools and whether or not you should publish them or not. But, at the end of the day, we're all very passionate about what we're doing to try to protect it. And there's different ways of how we do that, right? And different beliefs around how you secure organizations, and, whether or not you release offensive security tools or not. At the end of the day, collaboration, I think, is really key. And I think the collaboration we've seen between red and blue, offense and defense, has really made this industry substantially stronger.
Yeah, I agree totally. And I think, it's I think it's a little short-sighted to think about it in terms of, like, if we're not all sharing our tools and our knowledge, the other side absolutely is. They're all working together. They're all sharing this information. And so there's no way we can ever compete if we're not also doing that same level of sharing. And I think that's an important part, that, there's very little security that comes through obscurity, right? Like,
going back,
there's a place for it, but
we've all been in this industry for a number of years. You flash back 10, 15 years ago, and red teaming, or at that time, early penetration testing, was kind of a mystic art. It was like a mystic dark art where no one knew what we were doing. Right? We had all these crazy tools and these exploits and all the stuff that we never shared. And we would, specifically focus from a red teaming perspective on, well, here's your technical flaws that you have. And you wouldn't understand the tradecraft that went into that. And so what happened with organizations and companies is, they would fix and plug these holes, but they didn't look at what happens after, initial access is established. And, changing our frame of mind that it's not all about creating this castle, because we can never have a castle anymore, especially with, cloud infrastructure and, work from home and everything else that's going on out there. We have to focus on what happens if an intruder is successful. And what does that look like from an attacker's perspective around privilege escalation, lateral movement, post-exploitation scenarios that we see out there? And that was largely a very, very close-kept secret in the security industry during those periods of time. And companies didn't progress forward. In fact, they probably got worse, down the road. And then when you started to see, well, now we're starting to understand these offensive capabilities, we're starting to understand what this looks like. Now companies actually have a defensible approach where they can say, well, if we invest in monitoring and detection, and we can boot out an attacker day 1 versus day 6, day 10, day 15, day 20, 6 months down the road, we have a much better way of handling our risk, as an organization. And we don't ever want to go back to that. The collaboration of sharing tools, being able to simulate what an actual attacker would do, and to also emulate that too, known specific TTPs and stuff like that. That sharing and collaboration is so invaluable that, to me, it continuously progresses forward. Now, there's responsibility that we have in it. We don't want to drop a 0-day, when people aren't patched. And, there's discussions around, well, when's appropriate time to actually release a POC after a patch has been, those are all good discussions, I think, to have. But at the end of the day, we have to have the same types of tools and the same type of collaboration that the organized crime groups, that the nation states do, in order for us to have any type of way of handling these types of threats in the future.
Absolutely. For me, I'm always worried about the unknown, and I'd rather get things out there as quickly as possible, so you actually know how to deal with the threat. You know how to deal with it, because once it's out there, then you actually understand what the risks are, how you can mitigate it, how you can harden it, and how you can actually make it more difficult. Because one of my things is that I agree that once the attacker's in the door, I've actually found that, it's actually better to force the attackers to take more risks. If you get them to actually taking more risks and repeating their techniques and processes over and over again, and you provide them more hurdles to go through, what happens is you force them to create more noise. And I find that the more noise they create in the network, the more chance you have of detecting them and that better chance that you have at basically preventing them from doing something catastrophic to your business. And that's ultimately kind of what we look to do, is that you always assume breached. You always assume that they have access. In a lot of cases, I've done incident response. I end up finding that you find another attacker that's on the network at the same time, because you're starting to actually pull through the logs. You find that you're not just dealing with one attacking group, you're dealing with multiple. Maybe they have different motives in the environment, but that's a lot of times you uncover is that you're dealing with sometimes with multiple groups. What's your thoughts around those? Is that when you're actually getting into those and you're starting to do threat hunting, should organizations always assume that they're breached and continually looking?
Yeah. First of all, a couple topics there that I want to hit on. If you look at something like Hafnium, for example, where China was actively exploiting 20,000, 30,000 plus on-premise Exchange servers, the cat's out of the bag at that point in time, right? So what was interesting to see is that when Hafnium was being exploited, the patch was out for about a week. A proof of concept came out, and GitHub removed that proof of concept out from the system, which I can tell you that our forensics and incident responders, once they had access to that POC, it was substantially easier for them to look for artifacts on those systems and to be able to identify what was occurring. The collaboration that we had between the red team and the incident response over at Trusted Tech, you're not going to get that if you're just looking at it from a pure incident response perspective. Well, Microsoft release was not sufficient to do a full investigation on an incident response side. So, that type of release helps things out. And the POC was intentionally broken, missing a very key critical part for remote code execution, yet it was still removed. And we can't have that. We have to be transparent about what's occurring out there. Yeah. And I can understand if it's an O day and no one's patched, but I also understand, listen, it takes time for these organizations to patch as well. And, and we have to be very mindful of that. We have a responsibility for that. I probably would have waited a little bit longer to release a POC. But at the end of the day, we shouldn't be hindering researchers. But on that point, threat hunting is probably one of the largest missing links that I see in most organizations. You look at the cyclical effect of security operations centers, and traditionally SOCs just sit there and they have the default alarms that they get in their SIEM or their EDR product, and they assume that they're fine and good, and it never matures. They rely heavily off of the technology itself versus trying to understand what attack patterns could potentially happen in their environment. So things like assumed breaches, where you come in and you go through a series of emulation cycles, or if you're at a level to handle simulations, you start to look at their environment and say, well, here's where you have gaps in your environment where you can't identify, specific threats in those specific chains. And your whole goal is, if you look at something like the MITRE ATT&CK framework, is to have really good coverage and effectiveness of those different types of attacks that can happen throughout different stages of an attack, so that, as you'd mentioned, it creates more and more noise so that you're responding to those much more effectively. So for me, threat hunting and going through, the cycle of looking at not just north to south, but east to west traffic, looking at parent process relationships, persistence hooks like registry modifications, PowerShell syntax, scripting languages, living off the land. There's a whole attack surface, specifically on Windows, Linux, and OS X that we need to be able to identify to, look for unusual patterns of behavior and baseline that pattern of behavior in our environment, if it's normal, if it's legit, and then look for those deviations. And that's really where threat hunting comes into place. And the missing link is that threat hunting team also has to provide a input mechanism for the security operations center to get better at monitoring detection. So it becomes this circle where, your SOC is improving, your threat hunting, teams are assuming that there's a breach, and you're going through those cycles of looking through information. They're building detections based off of the threat models and the different adversaries that are in play. And all of a sudden, your entire, security operations center and your monitoring detection program, elevates very fast, faster than it ever has before, because it's not staying in that stagnant state. But a lot of companies can't grasp that concept of, well, we install the tool, we're good. You're not good. You're
It's
Well, the other thing on that, I mean, having worked on, user entity behavioral analytics, but, product, right? One of the things we know is that like machine learning and AI, like AI is, just a bunch of if statements and automation and machine learning is all well and good, but like you can fool these models. You can, if you do things right, those tools will never detect it as an anomaly because it's not an anomaly anymore. And so you have to be active. You have to put on, a human has to get involved at some point. And you can't just rely on these tools and these technologies, which can be fooled, which can be taken advantage of and make you feel like you're secure when really you're not anymore. And, I think that's an area that's missed and by a lot of organizations as well.
Yeah. Yeah, addition to that, one of the things, Dave, I got into, it reminds me years ago, I dealt with we basically, fortunate enough, we prevented a major breach from happening. And it was, what was happening was we were actually going to deploy it ourselves. But what prevented it from happening, actually, the attackers gained access to a software catalog, basically embedded and executable. We were going to deploy that using basically a software delivery mechanism. And ultimately, what happened was is that the attacker knew, they knew our basically schedule. They knew basically everything we were going to be doing. They had access to our calendars and project. But what happened was we basically had a gut feeling. We decided to do unpredictability. We decided to do just this ad hoc, said, let's double check, let's run basically file heists against all the libraries to make sure we have the right versions. And all of a sudden we had a mismatch. Something that was unpredicted, something that was ad hoc, just something we just basically did, sparingly without having a plan or having, basically, a project behind it. We decided, let's do this, let's do it right now. How should organizations, I think for me, even when I get into instance and I look at the logs, there's so much noise out there when you do have an attacker that's in the environment. You'll see a lot of the data in the logs. It's right there in front of it. It's just organizations are not looking sometimes in the right places. Should organizations get into more doing those types of ad hoc, let's say sporadic, unpredictable types of basically, looking at logs, going, let's go all of a sudden and look in this location. Let's go and look at the logs on certain systems and see, is everything clean? Is there any, suspicious activity? How should organizations really get into, getting outside of the norm? Just, let's say, relying on those, default settings and predictable, outcomes.
I think you hit the nail on the head from the perspective of you need to kind of understand and know your environment, right? And look for the differential behaviors that occur in your environment that are not normal. And there, these are, when you look at the different techniques that attackers use, I mean, it's not rocket science. The majority of them use the same type of methods, right? You look at REvil, for example. They focused on living off the land and run DLL32 for injection, for DLL injection to download their binary. Same thing happened for DarkSide. You look at the most latest attack coming from the same group that was specifically behind SolarWinds, the Russian FSB attacks. When you look at that, the methods, everybody looks at that, oh my gosh, they use an ISO file to mount it to get their malware. But if you look at all the stages afterwards, that occurred, well, yes, they might have used kind of a novel attack on using an ISO as a way to get around and skirt around detection. But then you look at okay, well, they use run DLL32 to import in, this executable, this binary, which then calls out and downloads your second stage, which then calls run DLL32 again, which then does registry modifications in run for registry modifications for persistence. Like, all of those are clear red flags that something's wrong in your environment, right? You don't see those happen on a regular basis. So there are very specific patterns that we can look for in our environment. And one of my biggest areas that I love going through, I can spend all day, all night looking at parent-child process relationships. I get so much value from parent-child process relationships because you can literally spot an attacker, unless they're extremely, extremely good, in those parent-child process relationships. For example, why is Explorer.exe kicking off Outlook.exe, kicking off Excel.exe, kicking off PowerShell.exe? It's boom, you have something right there that you need to go and investigate, clear as day. It could be a business process, right? But most likely, probably not. So, I think it's really important for organizations to focus on visibility. Number one, we need to have access to the data. So installing things like Sysmon, for example, Windows event log tracing for Windows is fantastic, right? From a logging perspective, or ways that you can get other logs off of your systems to centralize them to be able to conduct these types of activities. And then getting into a cyclical effect, and it doesn't need to be, you look at some organizations that have dedicated threat hunters that are doing it every single day, every single minute, every single exercise. Most organizations can't do that. But let's just say you're going to do it once a month or once a quarter, to go through that data, to have that visibility and to look for those abnormal patterns. And then from there, writing detection so that you don't see them again. That is a way to continuously improve your monitoring and detection capabilities in your environment that most organizations just don't go through. And it's just carving a day out, carving 2 days out, carving an hour out, carving a lunch out, and just going through that data to figure something out. And getting into a cyclical effect of doing that regularly, I think, is really important.
Yep.
It's interesting that you mentioned that, because it reminds. So my background as a software engineer, one of the things that we enjoy doing, and we recently did at Cybrary, was like a hackathon, right, where the software devs and sales and all parts of the different organization work together to like come up with cool, unique product features and whatever. And hackathons have been sort of proven like pretty successful for like jumpstarting innovation. Doing that, taking that same sort of idea and applying it and saying like, hey, you know what, we're going to carve out 2 days and we're going to do like more of like like a real hackathon of like actually looking at our systems and doing that, I think, is an interesting
hackathons are great.
Parallel.
There's a number of companies that
yeah.
We do work with that have regimented hackathons where anybody can kind of compete, and they either have simulated environments they run through, but like that type of stuff creates a lot of creativity. And it also from a software development perspective, one of the things I remember, I was doing an assessment for an organization, and we were completely flying underneath the radar. We had access to a bunch of systems. And we were high-fiving each other because this was a really tough customer to get into from a red teaming perspective. And we had accessed a database from another server to get some of the data for that database. And literally the database administrator had done a hackathon and was super paranoid about unusual connections to their database and was monitoring all the IP addresses coming into the server, like literally real time. Like he had a window open of source and destinations, and I'm like, seriously, someone actually does that? And caught us, and it was because of that hackathon that literally spawned his interest of like, well, I'm going to look for unusual patterns because I own this infrastructure, and I'm in charge of it, so I'm going to ensure that no one's connecting to it from an unusual perspective, and literally snagged us, and it blew up the whole thing. So we had to go start from ground zero again. So those types of things are huge, and getting people into that mindset to understand offensive capabilities is fantastic.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the things you mentioned earlier that I think is critical is you mentioned about the red team, blue team working together. We have this more concept of purple teaming now. And I think for me, I think that's one of the things that organizations really need to embrace, because it's how you basically cross-pollinate. Similar to hackathons, you bring a lot of people from different skills and backgrounds and knowledge together in order to pair them up into basically creating something great, innovative. And I think that's really where we need to have, from a red team and a blue team perspective, is we need the defenders to know the techniques and the methods that attackers use. So basically, we need to educate them, because it really helps. Basically, one of the things I always say is that the best way you can defend is knowing hacker techniques. Basically the methods that they use, so you can actually know what to look for. Just as you mentioned that, the person looking for those database connections, basically once they knew that was something to look for, they implemented and been monitoring it consistently. How important is purple teams today? And is it something you see as much more, the industry needs to embrace and develop further in the future?
I'm such a huge advocate of purple teaming. In fact, I think it's one of the, I think the industry has gotten, and I understand why, the industry has gotten caught up on just doing penetration tests, and then they hear the sexy word red teaming. And I would say 90% of the customers that we perform red teams on are nowhere near the ability to handle a red team or what a red team engagement produces. Because, a red team is really, there's a big difference between adversary emulation and adversary simulation. And adversary emulation, you're taking known tactics, techniques, and procedures of attackers, and you're working, collaboratively to figure out where you have gaps and weaknesses in from your monitoring and detection program, that purple teaming aspect where, it's not about being covert, it's about being overt. You're spending time with the blue team and going back and forth, and you walk out of there with 20 kick butt, detections that you never had before, that are high fidelity, high, confidence, detections out there that are going to help identify attackers now that you didn't have before in the past. And they want to skip that step and say, well, I want a red team. I want to simulate this nation state at this sophistication level. And then you completely wreck them. And they're like, well, what are we supposed to do with this? I'm like, exactly. Like, you're not at a point yet to handle the simulation efforts because your program's not mature enough yet to get to that specific point. So our whole goal should really be, listen, if you need penetration tests for validation, for verification, that makes sense, right? Compliance, et cetera, whatever. But really our efforts should be doing more overt testing to understand where do we have weaknesses in that, not just the initial access phase around, hey, we found a technical exposure to exploit or to phish a user or whatever, but assume that there's a breach there, and what happens after all these different phases of an attack to really build your detections out. And that's really where we need to mature as an industry, because not a lot of companies do it. And it just boggles my mind, because I'd rather walk out of an engagement with 20 new detections then have one or two technical fixes that I'm going to fix, and maybe, some strategy things that I need to fix, but I'm not walking out of there with anything that's really made my security program substantially better.
Yeah, and being on the, having, I think a number of years ago, sort of made a similar mistake where, we wanted to we hired a security company and we started working with them. We're like, we don't even like, the nice thing was we went into it going like, we just know that we need to improve our security. We don't really like, and like, so what's going to work best? And, in our head, it was like, yeah, obviously we want you guys to do like a pen test. And they went through the exact same explanation of like, we can guarantee that we're going to get in. Let's not do that. Let's actually help you like to understand what you really need. And let's go through all of this. And that was so beneficial and so eye-opening and so much better than and that conversation of like, yeah, we're gonna get in. That's just a waste of 20, 30, 10, whatever thousands of dollars that you're gonna get like one or two things out of. So I think
when you're getting an assessment done, let's just say by a third party or even your internal organization, you're very much locked into a fixed time window. So you have this amount of time to complete. And so, a lot of customers are like, well, hey, I want you to get around our EDR. I want you to do this. I want you to do this. I want you to do this. So we'll spend all this time getting around their products. And by the time we get access to a system, and we have remote code execution and we're on a system, we're already 80% through the hours that we've already done. And so again, your value is substantially lower of what you're getting for those types of engagements. Yes, we proved we can own you. Great. That's anybody, right? But what happens after the fact? And our mindsets really have to shift away from that initial access component. Yes, it's important to do vulnerability management. Yes, it's important to build protective mechanisms to shut a lot of these things down ahead of time. It's important to have multi-factor authentication, network segmentation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But at the same time, what happens when an attacker is successful? And can we identify those different stages of an attack and boot them out much faster? And that's really what our mind shift has to be in security in order to have any type of defensible approach. I guarantee you, I don't know anything about Colonial's program, but rumor is they had McAfee, the malware itself shut down McAfee. The first thing they did was shut down McAfee. That was their only way of identifying a threat. So attackers literally had maintained access across their entire environment. After that component was eliminated. You can't have that. Like, we have to be focusing on all of the different stages after, if they get around our preventative mechanisms. And this isn't a knock on McAfee or anything else. I'm just saying, you went out the window, once McAfee was circumvented. So,
yeah, absolutely. In a lot of the cases, what I see, and one of the things I've learned a lot is basically from adversary techniques. Actually, going into the incidents and preventing them or stopping them midway through the attack, and all the things they've left behind. That's where I learn. I've learned so much from basically attackers leaving a lot of breadcrumbs and scripts and everything behind. And ultimately, what you have to find, similar, the ones you mentioned, is that you might have a lot of security on an endpoint, on a device or a server. But if you're giving somebody local administrator rights on that system, all of a sudden they simply run a script and it switches everything off. They can do the changes, modifications. They can, change the registry keys.
At least make it a little bit difficult. At least make it a little bit difficult for them,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly, but that's it. Some people have a assumption that since they're running these, but they sometimes assume that a local administrator right on a system is limited to just that one system. But basically, what it simply allows them to turn it into a staging machine. That machine can simply be turned into something that can then be used for enumerating the entire network. For them, basically, you'll be standing and watching and living off the land and learning about what other security defenses you've in place. So, absolutely, I think you're right. Is that sometimes, let's assume that you already have access. Let's assume you have, gain access to a system and the environment, and let's do the test from there to see if you're triggering the right alarms, that if you're creating enough noise so that your defenders can actually detect it. And I think that's really where we need to stop assuming that there is that castle, that there is that perimeter anymore. We have to assume that, the perimeter's gone, they're in the network. How can we further detect them when they're in that network? How can we make sure we have that visibility?
And what you said right there, for some reason, is so difficult for organizations to understand. They assume that, hey, we bought this firewall, we bought this, specific piece of technology, we're good to go, right? And what they don't recognize is that there's more things after that we have to focus on. It doesn't just stop at preventative. And when you start going through these emulations where you assume a breach occurs and you're starting to test, what you can see from again, when you start to go through these assumed breaches, there are preventative things you can put in place to shut them down too. So it's not just detective. It's also, hey, is there a preventative mechanism that we're not using? For example, why should a regular user ever call reg SVR32? There's no reason, right? In the System32 directory, commonly used as a living off the land for remote code execution and downloading. So can we disallow reg SVR32 from ever being, used from our, from an application control or allow listing perspective, to say, okay, well, we're just going to shut this down from a regular user context. There are preventative things that we can glean off of this that make it much more difficult for adversaries. And for those that we can't do preventative mechanisms, placing in detective controls, allow us to be able to identify them as it's going along. But you have to go through those cycles. Again, the industry is like, well, hey, I had a pen test done this year and we did awesome. We're great. Well, okay, that's one specific test. How do you actually fare when there's a compromise in your environment? And as you had mentioned, assuming a breach has occurred, testing it from after initial access and going in after that is insanely valuable. And purple teaming literally should be what we're focusing on 90% of the time, not the covert testing that we typically do.
So, and I think what's causing some of I'm optimistic in terms of the shift, because I think the costs. I think part of the reason why it's been so hard is not that the organization itself can't understand it or grasp it. It's more that the costs haven't been as clear, like the risk and how much it's going to cost me if this were to happen, and so on and so forth. And those costs just continue to go up and up and up. And so I think more and more organizations are being forced to
look at the news right now with Colonial Pipeline and JBS. These aren't sophisticated actors. This isn't like, nation state Russia coming in from a supply chain perspective for remote code execution and tucking backdoors in and pushing updates out, right? These are relatively less sophisticated attackers using common techniques that we all are very, very well aware of. But yet the shock of that and the what executive, I can't tell you how many board calls I've had with different companies. Like, what are we doing for ransomware? Like, hey, by the way, we should have been talking about this 10 years ago, not now. But second, here's the things that we need to start focusing on. And I think you're right. I think that conversation of well, maybe we aren't protected. Maybe we don't have the right controls in place. Maybe we do need to look at this. I think that's starting to happen now. And I think the businesses are really starting to understand the destructive nature of what's actually occurring here. We've been talking about it for years. Like, critical infrastructure attacks, we've been talking about since I started in the industry 20 plus years ago, right? We've been crying wolf forever. It just finally happened, right? I remember I was on a panel over at Rapid7 and I was on there with HD Moore, and HD was wrong, by the way. I'll have to call that out there. He's a good friend. But he was right. No, he was just too fast to think about it. He said, I believe we'll see a major attack on, our oil and gas, that could be potential loss of life or major shortages or things like that. And this was probably, 6 years ago. And he said, I think it's going to happen within the next year. So he was right. He was right on what was going to happen. Just timing was a little bit off, right? And I think that's what we're seeing now is that, it's real, it's happening to larger and larger organizations. You look at universal health systems that shut down their ERs. You look at Acer computers, they couldn't manufacture computers. You look at all these different companies now that are pretty large, organizations are being, completely shut down. I think, companies are like, okay, we're on notice now. The government's not going to protect us. We have to do something. So what is that? And I think that conversation's finally starting to occur.
Yeah, I agree. It's a couple of years too late. We've already had, WannaCry and NotPetya. We had the Ukrainian energy sector shut down. So these are things we've known for several years. But it's always been a bit further away. It's been it's been those other companies.
We can't get our meats.
Been impacted. But
that's a major problem.
yeah.
Right. If I'm filling garbage bags with gasoline, then
I still can't believe that.
I don't know if it was real or not, but it was like two guys with AR-15s. With plastic bags, filling plastic bags up, guarding these plastic bags with the AR-15s. I'm like, man, stuff is getting real. This cyber stuff is getting real.
Right. I saw a video of a guy filling the back of his pickup truck, and I was like, "Are you going to drive around with gasoline just sloshing around back there?"
And sometimes when fear makes people do.
It wasn't
things.
That bad. It really was not that bad, right? We had like a week of disruption, which I'm not saying was a good thing, but it wasn't like we were looking at months of outages or things like that. It was. But you see how much chaos this creates by one organization, 85+% critical infrastructure owned by private sector, can cause a disruption from a cyber perspective. I think it's finally clicking to people that, like, hey, it's not just our iPhone that can get hacked. It's not just, our computer and our pictures that get stolen. It's like literally how we live our daily lives, and a complete disruption to our food, to our energy, to our water. I mean, all this stuff now is possible. We've known it's possible in the security industry, but now executives are like, whoa, like we've neglected security forever. We actually need to do something here now.
Right. Or maybe not neglected, but certainly not invested as much as we should have.
I would say a lot of organizations have just done the bare minimum to even call it security. That's the challenge.
Right. I mean, I think there is a lot of box checking. There is a lot of, we want to get this contract. What do we have to do? We have to pay these guys some amount of money so we can check this box. There's no question about that. So I do want to get back to the Purple team and learning and stuff.
Yeah, I want to get I want to kind of get around the security research side of things and the purple teaming side. Is that how important is security research in the industry today? And the sharing side of things, I'd like to get your thoughts, because sometimes I find that there's a negative perception against the security research industry, especially from a media perspective, that creates that negative. And I always find that most, I consider myself a hacker, but the problem is that that's such a bad persona. A bad, basically, recognition in the media industry that they see as a hacker is such a bad person. But majority are good citizens, and security research is so vital. And a lot of security research is sometimes putting even their, basically personal lives on the line to do research, because there always is that gray line between the legal aspect of things as well. How important do you think it is, and the recognition that some people should deservedly get for at least bringing things to the surface?
Yeah, security researchers for me, there's a Kevin Durant meme where it always says you're the real MVP if you're into basketball. Hopefully people have seen that because we make that reference here. But security researchers are the real MVPs, right? It's important to understand that security research drives this industry forward, whether that's researching an attack and understanding how that attack works. So, and it's not just offensive security researchers, it's researchers that are, reverse engineering malware and figuring out how they work. And, the first one to get a sample and then share that out with the community so that we can all kind of break it open so that everybody else is protected, all the way to coming up with a new way of, identifying attacks, or coming up with a new attack vector itself. Security research is literally, you talk about a building, it's the foundation for the building. Without security research, we don't have any insight into security products or products in general, how well they fare against attackers or adversaries that could be potentially exploited, as well as what other adversaries are doing. So for me, it's a vital component of everything that we do day to day at Trusted Sec and at Binary Defense. Research is paramount. And one thing I'll say is a few years ago, this is about 4 years ago, one of our folks on our team, Justin Elzy, who runs our research team, as well as our red team, and Carlos Perez runs our actual research team, but Carlos reports through Justin. Justin said, listen, it's getting increasingly harder for some of our more sophisticated customers for us to break in. And it's also, very vital for us to have our own tooling weaponization. So, we invested very heavily in our own research division over at Trusted Sec about 4.5 years ago. And so we have a fully dedicated research team that all they do is look at weaponization tooling, detections, purple teaming aspects, things to that effect, so that we are continuously, kind of spawning innovation from ourselves to make our own teams better. And it's been really successful. And I think you really need to have that today, whether it's public research or your own private research team, if you can do it, to really keep up with what's happening out there. And I really believe that, the vilification of some of the security researchers that we've seen is really a myopic view of the grand scheme of things of how the whole security industry works together. Now, again, I want to say that there's responsibility that we have to have in the security research side. Dropping 0 days, time of the past, right? That was the cool thing to do back, in the millwork days and everything else. But that times have changed. From that perspective, we have to focus on responsible disclosure. To not impact organizations. Do no harm, right?
Do no harm.
Yep. And I think that's the important case to remember here, is that security researchers deserve the credit for the time and effort. I mean, some of these exploits, it takes months and months and months of research to go and do. And it's just these brilliant minds doing incredible things. I mean, I remember when I first wrote my first 0 day, and it took me, and this is by the way, it was way easier back then than it is today with all the preventative mechanisms that you have, and going through that, and, when you finally take like a bug, for example, a crash, and you hijack that crash and you understand how the logic works and you redirect execution flow and you're able to get remote code execution, onto a system. It's the most amazing feeling ever. But man, it took months to do something like that, right? In time and effort. So these security researchers should definitely get the credit that they deserve, and really, driving the industry forward. And at the same time, obviously be responsible with it. But we should recognize that, and we should continuously promote that because it's important for the industry to continuously move it forward, or else our adversaries are not going to slow down. I mean, it's not like, hey, Russia and China, Iran, North Korea, like we're just going to stop hacking tomorrow. Not going to happen, right?
You're actually building teams to do specifically just that. So, so we have to make sure that our resources are getting skilled and talk to things quickly as well. Mike, did you want anything more?
I was just a little bit. Just so we were talking a little bit about learning and how the information sharing goes, and I think one of the things that I learned for over my career is going to certain conferences and things like that has been a great way, even as a software dev, going to some of these has led to me being a more security oriented technologist, if you will, depending on who you ask. And so, I'm curious what your thoughts are on that. I think that's I think one of the pluses that came out of COVID is how many of these conferences that were totally 100% in real life have a virtual aspect. And I think it really opens the door. And I'm just curious what your thoughts are on how to get, sort of more people to these conferences.
Yeah, conferences are really important. For one, the relationship aspect is key. Like that's probably number one for me, right? You get to meet peers in your industry or somebody that is like-minded to you that you can learn from. And that's really important. When I was first coming into the industry, it was a very different industry. There wasn't a lot of technical information out there. There wasn't documents. There wasn't training courses. There wasn't college programs for cybersecurity. And, I got lucky because I got part of a group that was called Remote Exploit at the time in IRC. And Remote Exploit eventually turned into offensive security. So, the guys that made Backtrack in IMAX and WAPix and Kali, and became very good friends with Mutz, Maddie. And, and I was able to learn from that whole group and that whole team and become kind of one of their core members. So I was on the Backtrack development team. I helped with Exploit DB. And so, I learned a ton from people that were figuring things out that hadn't been done before. And that was really instrumental for me, having that type of peer group that we can learn off of one another. And then, really skyrocketed my career. So I think, connections, networking, especially that you get these events, either it's in person or remote, are really important. But also, you find a topic that you like and you can take, a security researcher's topic and you can expand on that, right? You can take that concept and use that somewhere else to make it even better. And that's the cool part about this industry. I think conferences really provide a lot of great value, both from a talk perspective as well as the networking, aspects. Obviously, I started at a conference called DerbyCon with a few of my good buddies. The biggest thing with DerbyCon was that community feel where if you're brand new to the industry or you're, seasoned, everybody was on the same level and we're all working together to try to help one another. And you look at that, you have the same type of feel at B-Sides. I'm a huge fan of Wild West Hacking Fest with John Strand's group. I think it was a really great one. I always go to Deadwood. I love it there. It's just like a middle of nowhere, feel like you're in the old Wild West. And
one that I recently went to digitally was KernelCon, which was fantastic. KernelCon was awesome. Watching Joe Grand running around trying to find burners to do some solving.
Joe is amazing.
Was quite impressive.
Joe is amazing. One of my heroes in the security industry and a friend. And KernelCon's great. I was there in person, 2 years ago, prior pandemic, and phenomenal run conference as well. And in these, I think what you see is a lot of these smaller, tight knit conferences for me are a lot better than the large size conferences. I feel like I get lost in the big conferences. Like, I feel overwhelmed at the big conferences. Like I can't network, I can't socialize, I don't know where to go. There's just a lot of stuff out there. With these smaller size conferences, it's definitely much more intimate, and you get to hang out with people, meet new people. And that's the thing. A lot of problem I think we have with DerbyCon is that DerbyCon started off with this as a small, tight knit conference, and then just blew up to epic proportions. We're like, hey, this isn't really what we signed up for. This is too much. We're just running this for fun. We don't want 5,000 people at a conference. So we kind of bowed out on that. But it's one of those things where you look at the tight knit conferences, like what B-Sides is, and a lot of the ones that spawn around there, and you just find so much value from those types of conferences. I love going to smaller size conferences. In fact, when I get asked to do smaller size conferences, I prefer those over the big ones because I find it just to be so much more valuable for me.
Yeah, and I think one of the downsides to the big conferences, it's like anything, like whenever you're talking about research, right? Like when a big organization is sponsoring research or a big organization is sponsoring a talk, like there's this other motive, which is to sell you on something. Yeah. Whereas when you go to the more intimate, the smaller, the people who are just doing the research, it's more pure.
It's educational.
You're going to get the sort of more raw, consumable, applicable information, and they're not trying to sell you on a solution to the problem. They're just showing you the cool tools. And I 100% agree with the pick a topic that you're interested in, and it's going to be applicable to other things.
Oh yeah.
I learned so much from the car hacking guys that applied to what we were doing
James.
with like, I mean, we were building a totally unrelated system, but it had a message bus. And so all of the lessons that, and the nice thing is we could actually throw real technology at ours because we weren't limited by the budget of what a car can do and the timing and all the rest of it. And so seeing what they're able to do and then being like, aha, this is what we need to do in our system to protect against those types of attacks. It's just so interesting. I definitely encourage people, even if you're not really, interested in security research or becoming that type of security person, if you're involved in technology, if you're a software developer, you get so much benefit out of attending these things. And I think the opportunity, look for opportunities to learn what the other side is doing, because it just pays benefits. And I guess that gets back to that whole purple team, red team, blue team, and how we can work together as an organization to just improve security, or not as an organization, but as a industry.
I look at like
security across
look
the
at
board.
the old school days of DEF CON at Alexis Park, right? And I think that type of model works extremely successful because, I remember when I first I was in the military at the time, and they flew me out to go to DEF CON, and I had just turned 21, which was a mistake to go to Vegas when you first turn 21. Like literally turned 21 like 2 days before I got to Vegas. But the best part about Alexis Park is, I remember seeing some of like my early heroes in the security industry, like the Shmoo Group, for example, or CDC. And I remember seeing, Bruce Potter up on stage, and they had just done they had like this UPS box that, they would physically break into a location. And it was also, it looked like a UPS, but it was, actually sending all the data back and, doing man in the middle attacks and all this other stuff, giving remote access, and a lot of the, and they did it for fun. It was just like, we're going to do this because it's awesome and it sounds cool. And it's, yeah, and that's what you get from those intimate type things where like, someone's like, hey, this is exciting for me and this is awesome. I want to share this with my peers and my friends in an intimate type of environment where I'm not, at this big stage on, where I got to have ATM spitting out cash and stuff like that. It's a different type of perspective, and it's that community, right? We talk about, you heard the concept of tribes, the tribe of hacker books, the tribes you have. There's a tribe. There's tribes. A lot of tribes inside of the information security industry. The community aspect of tribes, to me, is the most fascinating and probably the most collaborative and sharing that continuously drives the industry forward. Those security researchers, is a great example, wanting to share that information with tribes that are similar to themselves. So it's really that fundamental piece where we're all working together for one common goal to make the world a better place. That is a noble cause. It's one that I think is really good. And I think those small conferences really promote that. And, to give it out to the conference organizers, I mean, it's so much stress running those and expenses, and hopefully you get, sponsors to be able to do it. There's companies like yourself. Obviously, I've seen you folks sponsor a number of conferences out there before. I've seen your name all over the place. So, kudos to you for the fostering of that community. But, we have to continuously foster that because the industry is getting very large, but we still have to have that intimate setting that it needs to be important.
Yeah, we have to attract.
Well, right, and we need to continue to grow it.
We have to get new talent and people to come in, because when people look at the industry, it's quite scary. And that's one thing I wanted to touch on, Dave, is that, I've seen in the past year, I've seen it, kind of growing, is around definitely around the mental health side of things, because we are very dedicated and passionate into what we do. I've spent countless hours and days just getting into research and getting stuck into things, and sometimes you forget to even step out and see the daylight. And I've seen it, probably more in the past year, I guess, because of the pandemic and everyone working remotely, and we're losing that. We're losing the intimacy from the conferences because we're not able to, meet up with your friends and your peers to do that sharing. And I've seen a lot of increase in social media in the past year where people are struggling. People are struggling by not getting that social aspect, by not being able to get into the community And sometimes, what do you recommend, in the industry? Do you recommend, how do people get help if they are struggling? What's the way that, some indications of, people to reach out to
that's one of my biggest fears for any of my employees at Trusted Sector Binary Defense, right? And it's what we call burnout, right? Burnout is a real thing in our industry because, as you mentioned, we are very passionate about what we do. We always want to continuously help, and we forget that we need to take time for ourselves, and that our personal lives need to be more than just cybersecurity. Now there's a difference. For me, I made cybersecurity my hobby, right? So I play around hacking and stuff like that for fun, but there's a time where you need to decompress. You need to give your mind a break. You need to go out for a walk. You need to do fitness. You need to spend time with your family. All of those things are extremely important to prevent burnout. And you also need to take time off. And that's the thing. We force PTO to our employees as much as possible. Like I probably send a once a month monthly reminder saying, listen, please take time off. Like, I don't care, if there's a pandemic. I know there's a pandemic out. Just take time off and hang out at your house. Do what you need to for yourself, because the time that you need to decompress and to unwind is so paramount to your overall stability, both as a employee, but also just as a person. And that's the most important thing, is that we're all people here. You see these folks that, and there's a term called imposter syndrome and things like that, where, people feel like, well, hey, I'm kind of riding off the back of others, or, I'll never be to a certain level of a certain person. That's not the case. We're all here to share our perspectives of our life experiences, and our experiences are unique to us. So you shouldn't worry about being an imposter. Your experiences are you, right? And it doesn't mean that you are an expert in car hacking. That's somebody else, right? You haven't spent your entire career focusing on car hacking. But hey, you spent your entire career working in this area, and I would consider you an expert in this area. Do you know everything? No, I don't know everything. I learn something new every single day. So, we have to recognize that there's no way that we can know everything. We have to take time for ourselves, and we have to recognize when we're burning out. And that's the biggest challenge I think I see most people run through is recognizing the symptoms of burnout. And
absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, I think the imposter syndrome one is one. So my dev team, probably about a month or two ago, we were all just sort of talking. We have a nice range of experience and years in the industry. And I think one of the most universal themes, especially amongst the more senior people, was not just that they sort of suffered from imposter syndrome, but the fact that they were able to recognize it and like turn it into a positive. And like, that's for me as well. Like, I know what I know and I know what I don't know. And like, yes, sometimes I feel a little bit like I'm an imposter or whatever, but I let that drive me, and I let that like help me to understand, like, that's why I have people like Jonathan on my team who can really keep me up to date, and I can, he makes me look good and stuff like that. And I think it's an important thing to recognize that, like, yes, just accept it and learn how to like deal with it in a positive way and turn it into a positive.
Yeah. I think for me, Dave, one of the things is that the most valuable thing in this entire world is our time. And if we don't take time for ourselves, that's the most valuable asset, is the time that we have in this earth. And if we don't take that time, you can never get it back. It's a one-way road. It's a one-way street that you can't reverse it. If you get your time machine to work, I'll be the first person.
Unless you're working on it, unless you have a DeLorean that you have to be working on.
Let me tell you, I've been trying to get that done soon. But
it'll only make you go back in time, but it won't be on the future. But it won't change your age. But I want to, I think that's a great point to end on, and I think it's really important is that absolutely, take care of yourself. As you're the number one important person, and always make sure to take time. And if you do find that you're burning out, you don't know how to deal with it, definitely reach out to somebody. There's a lot of people on social media, whether it be myself, Dave, or others, that will basically be there to point you in the right direction, or just provide you a set of ears to listen to. So, Dave, any final thoughts for the audience that you'd recommend?
Yeah, one thing I wanted to share to close out with is I sent an email just last Friday, so May 28th of 2021, to my entire company about burnout, and I do this once a quarter. Just to remind everybody that it's not a sign of weakness, that it's a sign of strength to recognize burnout. I just wanted to read it really quick, if you're okay with that. I sent this out to my entire company.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so I said, hey, all, I hope everybody's ready for a nice, long, and relaxing weekend here soon. I wanted to send out a reminder to everybody that burnout is a real thing. on recognizing that if you're burned out, it isn't a sign of weakness, it's a strength. We do some amazing work here, and our customers and our performance levels are always at the highest capacity. That requires us to continuously be racking our brains and going above and beyond in every aspect. I like to compare us to top athletes for various sports. Athletes are required to physically put their bodies through continual strain and stress on an ongoing basis. However, they focus very heavily on ensuring their bodies have a chance to recover and take the time needed for that. Very similarly here, we're flexing our brain muscles on a regular basis and performing at an athlete level. Your brain needs the time to unwind, to be there for family and friends, and to recover from the daily stressors we put our minds through. It's important to take PTO and time off for yourself and for your family. It's equally important to not overwork yourself and recognizing when you are. If you are burning out or feeling stressed, please let us know. Again, we don't view this as a sign of weakness, but a sign of strength. And I kind of go on after that, but just want to say, as much as I love working with every single one of you, at the end of the day, our lives are far more than work. Being there for family, being there for yourselves, and doing things that are hobbies and interests is what your life is about. We'll never look at someone taking time off or a reduction in workload or falling behind as a weakness here. So just, that was kind of the message I sent out to the entire team, just to say, listen, if you're struggling, just let us know. Like we can't help you if we don't know. And that's, one thing I think important for managers, especially in InfoSec, is to recognize that we put our folks through a lot of stuff that we require them to do on their day-to-day basis, and they're so compassionate about doing that work, and they know that it's for the greater good. So they get wrapped up in those day-to-day aspects. So, we have to recognize when burnout's there and really help our folks as it goes along. But, close on that, mental health is important. Industry-wide, I'm actually really optimistic on where we're at and where we're heading at from an industry perspective. I think yet we're, at a spot now that we never have been in the security industry. And I think it's, we're going to have definitely challenges. We're going to have organizations continue to get breached, but at the same time, I think we have the right mindset of defensible strategies.
Awesome. So absolutely. I think that was amazing. And I think that's not just a message to your employees now, but everyone who's listening to really take that, whatever company or whatever you're doing is really take that message and make it actionable. As I mentioned, time is the most important asset we have on this earth. So use it wisely. So Dave, it's been awesome having you on the show. It's been an honor. Mike, great having you, leading the co-host and the show today. So it's always awesome. It's fantastic. So for the audience out there, definitely tune in for One Access Denied. We're here to provide you, as much education as value as possible. And hopefully you get some lessons and some great ideas to really make the world a safer place. So again, thanks for listening. It's been awesome. Take care.
Thanks,
and
everybody.
See you next
Appreciate
time.
it.